Martin Kostkin wasn't a stranger to bad decisions. Most of his days were spent at O'Malley's bar, drowning his sorrows in cheap whiskey. Life hadn't been kind to him, and alcohol became his solace. On that fateful night, as the rain poured down on the sleepy town of Sturgis, South Dakota, Martin staggered out of O'Malley's, hoping to make it home before the storm got worse. That's when he heard the scream. It cut through the air like a knife, high-pitched and terrified, sending a chill down Martin's spine. He froze. The scream came from an alleyway up ahead. In a drunken haze, he stumbled toward the sound, drawn by a mix of morbid curiosity and a drunken sense of obligation. That's when he saw her, Elizabeth Thompson, the local prostitute, lying on the ground with blood pooling beneath her. Above her stood a tall man, face partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but Martin recognized him immediately. Eddie Frost. Everyone in town knew Eddie, a respected businessman with deep pockets and even deeper connections. He owned several properties and held sway over local politics. Seeing him there with a bloody knife in hand was like watching a nightmare unfold in real time. Tane's stomach turned, and for a moment he thought he might pass out, but survival instinct kicked in. Eddie hadn't seen him yet. Martin turned on his heels and ran, the sound of his boots slapping against the wet pavement mixing with the pounding of his heart. He didn't stop until he reached the police station, bursting through the door and collapsing in front of the night officer on duty. I saw Eddie Frost kill her," he gasped, pointing back toward the alley. "He killed Elizabeth Thompson. She's dead." The officer, clearly shaken, quickly radioed for backup. Within minutes, sirens wailed through the streets as police cars sped on, but by the time they arrived at Eddie Frost's grand estate on the hill, the situation took a bizarre and unexpected turn. Detective Emmett Beist wasn't the type to rush into things. A tall, burly man with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude, he had solved more murders than he could count. He approached every case the same way, methodically, calmly, with an eye for detail that most missed. When he got the call about Martin Kostkin's wild accusation, he wasn't thrilled. Drunken witnesses were unreliable, and Martin Kostkin was as unreliable as they came. Still, the officers arrived at Eddie's house, their lights casting an eerie glow on the manicured lawn. Eddie himself answered the door, cool as a cucumber, despite the late hour and the accusations that had been thrown his way. "Officer, what's all this about?" Eddie asked, looking genuinely confused as he leaned casually against the doorframe. His voice was calm, his shirt immaculate, no signs of a struggle. "We got a report, Mr. Frost, that there's been an incident," one of the officers replied, trying to keep things vague. "What incident?" Eddie raised an eyebrow, his demeanor unfazed. "A murder," the officer continued. "A man says he saw you kill Elizabeth Thompson." Eddie's face darkened for a split second before he let out a small laugh. "Elizabeth Thompson? She's not dead. In fact, I can prove it to you." Without waiting for a response, Eddie stepped back inside his home and, to the utter shock of the officers, called out, "Elizabeth, could you come down here for a moment?" A few moments later, footsteps echoed down the grand staircase. Elizabeth Thompson appeared, alive and well, dressed in a robe and slippers, looking a bit sleepy but unharmed. The officers exchanged puzzled glances. Martin Kostkin had been absolutely certain she was dead, but here she was standing before them, very much alive. Elizabeth smiled softly at the officers, seemingly confused by the commotion. "What's going on? Did something happen?" The officers stood speechless, unsure how to respond. They were about to leave when Detective Beist, arriving late to the scene, stopped them. He wasn't convinced by appearances alone. Despite the confusion, he had a gut feeling something darker was lurking beneath the surface. The next morning, Beist sat with Martin in the interrogation room, watching him carefully. Martin's hands trembled as he repeated his story. "I saw her dead in the alley. Eddie was standing over her, knife in hand. I swear to God, detective, I know what I saw." But the evidence said otherwise. Elizabeth was alive. Still, Beist couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Martin might be a drunk, but his terror was real, and he had seen a murder that night. Beist was sure of it. The real question now was, if Elizabeth wasn't the victim, then who was? Detective Emmett Beist leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, as he listened to Martin Kostkin's rambling recount of the murder yet again. The story was too vivid, too consistent for a man as drunk as Martin to have invented it. But every piece of tangible evidence pointed to the contrary. Elizabeth Thompson was alive, and Eddie Frost, well, Eddie's reputation as a businessman made him nearly untouchable in this town. But Beist trusted his gut more than reputations. Something about this didn't sit right. "Martin," he said, his voice steady, "You're sure it was Elizabeth Thompson you saw in that alley?" Martin nodded, his eyes wide with desperation. "I swear it. I know Elizabeth. I've seen her around enough to recognize her even in the dark. She was dead, detective. Eddie was standing over her with a knife. He killed her. I saw it." Beist paused, taking in Martin's trembling form. "But she's alive, Martin. You saw her yourself at Eddie's house." Martin's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "I don't know how that's possible. I don't know if Eddie's playing some sick game or what, but I saw her dead. I'm telling you it was her." Beist stood, pacing the small room as his mind raced. The case was a puzzle, the pieces scattered in ways that didn't make sense yet. The drunken witness, the alleged victim who wasn't a victim, and the man at the center of it all, Eddie Frost. If Martin had seen someone killed, but Elizabeth wasn't the victim, that left one burning question: who did he actually see die? "All right," Beist finally said. "I'm going to look into this, Martin. But you have to keep yourself out of trouble. If Eddie is dangerous, you running your mouth all over town is only going to get you hurt." Martin nodded weakly, grateful to be taken seriously. "I won't say a word, I just want to forget it, but I can't. That image, it won't leave my head." As Beist left the interrogation room, he felt the weight of the mystery settle heavily on his shoulders. He knew one thing for certain. Eddie Frost wasn't going to make this easy. The next morning, Detective Beist drove through the misty streets of Sturgis, heading for Eddie Frost's sprawling estate. How the town itself was small, close-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Eddie's house was a stark contrast, isolated, perched on a hill, its large iron gates a clear message to keep outsiders away. Beist parked his car just outside the gates and approached the intercom, pressing the button. A sharp click followed before Eddie's smooth voice came through the speaker. "Detective Beist, to what do I owe the pleasure this early in the morning?" "I'd like to ask a few more questions, Mr. Frost. It won't take long." A pause. Then the gates creaked open. Beist walked up the long, winding driveway, the weight of Eddie's looming mansion heavy in the fog. Eddie himself was waiting at the door, dressed impeccably as always, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Detective," Eddie said, extending his hand. Beist shook it, noting the firm grip, the confidence exuding from the man. "What can I do for you?" "I've got a few follow-up questions," Beist began, keeping his tone casual, "about the events of last night. Martin Koskin is insisting that he saw you kill Elizabeth Thompson in an alley." Eddie chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I'm sure you know the kind of man Martin is, unreliable at best. He probably had too much to drink and started seeing things." "Maybe," Beist agreed, his tone nonchalant, though he didn't believe it. "But I'm not entirely convinced it was just his imagination. You have any idea why he'd finger you for something like this?" Eddie's smile faded just a touch, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Detective, I don't know what kind of game Martin is playing, but it's not one I'm a part of. I've never had any issues with him. Frankly, I think you're wasting your time." Beist didn't flinch. He could feel the tension between them, thinly veiled beneath Eddie's practiced politeness. "It's not just Martin," Beist said, his tone sharpening. "Something doesn't add up. Elizabeth is alive, sure, but Martin saw someone die that night. If it wasn't her, then who was it?" Eddie stared at him for a moment before a sly smile crept back onto his face. "Detective, you're reaching. There's no body, no victim, and no crime. Unless you've got something more concrete than the ramblings of a drunk, I suggest you find a better way to spend your time." Beist held his gaze for a moment longer, reading the calm menace behind Eddie's eyes. Something was off about him, but for now Eddie was right, there was no evidence, just a hunch. Still, Beist wasn't done yet. "We'll see," Beist replied, turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Beist couldn't shake the feeling that Eddie Frost was hiding something big. The game had just begun, and Beist was determined to find out what pieces Eddie was keeping off the board. Detective Emmett Beist's next stop was Elizabeth Thompson's apartment, a modest building on the outskirts of town. The rain had picked up again, drumming against the roof of his car as he pulled up to the curb. Elizabeth lived a quiet life when she wasn't out working the streets. Most people in Sturgis avoided talking about her profession, though everyone knew. For Beist, it wasn't her line of work that interested him now, it was her connection to Eddie Frost and the mysterious events of the previous night. He knocked on the door, waiting as the sound of footsteps approached from the other side. Elizabeth opened the door slowly, eyes widening when she saw Beist standing there. "Detective Beist, I wasn't expecting." "Mind if I come in?" Beist interrupted, his tone polite but firm. He had questions and he wasn't leaving without answers. Elizabeth hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small, sparsely decorated, but clean. Beist's eyes scanned the room, his instincts always searching for something out of place. "Do you want coffee or anything?" Elizabeth offered, trying to seem casual, but her nervousness was palpable. "No, thank you." Beist sat down on the edge of her couch, his eyes meeting hers. "I'll get straight to the point, Elizabeth. I spoke with Martin Kostkin last night. He swears he saw you dead in that alley, blood everywhere, and Eddie Frost standing over your body with a knife." Elizabeth's face paled at the mention of Eddie's name. She quickly looked away, wringing her hands. "Martin's drunk most of the time. He must have been hallucinating." "Maybe," Beist agreed. "But I'm not so sure. Something's going on here, and I think you know more than you're letting on." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the window. "I don't know what you want me to say, detective. I'm alive. Martin made a mistake." "Elizabeth," Beist, he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've been doing this a long time. People don't mistake a dead body for a living person, not like that. If Eddie Frost is involved in something, you need to tell me. I can protect you, but only if you're honest with me." She stood up abruptly, pacing the room as tension radiated off her. "You don't know Eddie. He's dangerous. He owns half this town, and the other half answers to him. I don't want to get caught up in any of this." "That's exactly why I need you to talk to me," Beist pressed. "If Eddie's dangerous, if he's capable of murder, he won't stop. This might be your chance to get out from under his control." Elizabeth stopped pacing, her shoulders slumped. She looked defeated, as though the weight of her secrets was crushing her. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eddie, he's been paying me to keep quiet about certain things. There's a lot of people he does business with, people who don't want their dirty laundry aired out. If anyone finds out what I know, I'm dead." Beist's mind raced. Elizabeth was holding something bigger than he had anticipated, something powerful enough to make even someone like Eddie Frost nervous. But the connection to Martin's story still didn't add up. Why had Martin seen her dead? "What about last night?" Beist asked, voice firm. "Why would Martin think he saw you killed?" Elizabeth hesitated again, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know. I wasn't in that alley, detective, I swear. But if someone wanted Martin to believe I was dead, maybe they were trying to send a message." "A message to who?" Beist asked, though he had already guessed the answer. "To me," she whispered. "Or maybe to Eddie." Back at the station, Beist sat at his desk, replaying the conversation with Elizabeth in his mind. The pieces were still scattered, but he was beginning to see a picture emerge. Eddie Frost wasn't just some wealthy businessman dabbling in shady deals, he was controlling something much darker. Elizabeth was a pawn, someone who knew too much but had been silenced with money and threats. And Martin Kostkin, Martin had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to. But why fake Elizabeth's death? Why stage a murder in front of a town drunk? Beist's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. Officer Linda Hayes, a sharp young officer who had been helping with the case, stepped in, holding a file. "Detective, I think we've got something," she said, her voice brimming with cautious excitement. Beist motioned for her to continue. "We ran some background checks on Elizabeth and Eddie's other known associates. There's a connection we missed. At first, Eddie's business dealings go deeper than we thought. A few years ago, one of his partners disappeared under mysterious circumstances, a man named Richard Harper. There was a brief investigation, but it was closed when no body was found." Beist sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. "Richard Harper. Why does that name sound familiar?" Linda handed him the file. Harper wasn't just a business partner, he was close to Elizabeth. Some people even say they were involved romantically, but Eddie shut that down pretty quick. After Harper disappeared, no one talked about him again. Beist flipped through the file, his mind racing. Richard Harper's disappearance wasn't just a coincidence. It felt like another piece of Eddie Frost's empire, carefully swept under the rug. "So, what are we saying?" Beist asked, leaning back in his chair. "Eddie got rid of Harper, and now someone's trying to frame him for Elizabeth's murder?" Linda nodded. "It's possible. If Martin did see a murder, maybe it wasn't Elizabeth at all. Maybe it was someone else Eddie wanted gone." Beist's pulse quickened as the pieces started to click together, or someone Eddie already got rid of. The weight of the case was settling in now, but one thing was clear: if Richard Harper was dead, and someone was using that death to manipulate Eddie, things were about to get much more dangerous. Beist stood, grabbing his coat. "We need to find out what happened to Richard Harper. If Martin saw a murder, maybe it's Harper's body that's still out there waiting to be found." Detective Emmett Beist couldn't shake the feeling that Richard Harper's disappearance was the key to the mystery. It was the one thread that tied Eddie Frost's empire Elizabeth Thompson's fears and Martin Koskin's vision of a murder all together. Harper wasn't just some forgotten business partner. He was a ghost lurking behind every decision Eddie had made since the day he disappeared. Beist returned to his office, his mind buzzing. Officer Linda Hayes had been invaluable so far, and he needed her to help push this investigation further. When he found her at her desk, he wasted no time. "Linda, we need to track down anyone who knew Richard Harper. I'm talking friends, family, employees, anyone who could give us more information on his disappearance." Linda nodded, her fingers already tapping away at her keyboard. "I'll get started right away, Detective. There's bound to be something that didn't make it into the official report. I'll also pull property records, see if Harper had any places tied to his name that weren't looked at during the initial investigation." Beist leaned over her desk, watching as she pulled up Harper's old case file. It was thin, just a handful of pages. At the time, Harper had simply vanished. No body, no leads, just a trail of debt and a crumbling business partnership with Eddie Frost. "I'll also reach out to the coroner," Linda continued. "We should see if any unidentified bodies were found in the area around the time Harper went missing. You never know what might have slipped through the cracks." "Good idea," Beist said, impressed by her thoroughness. "Let me know what you find. I'm going to pay Eddie another visit, but this time I'm not asking politely." The drive to Eddie Frost's estate felt heavier this time. Beist's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as he considered his next move. He wasn't going to let Eddie brush him off again. Richard Harper's name had barely come up during his last conversation with Eddie, but Beist knew it was crucial. Eddie had something to hide, and Beist was determined to find it. When Beist arrived at the mansion, the gates were already open, as if Eddie had been expecting him. Beist walked up the driveway, his shoes crunching on the gravel, the tension palpable in the cool autumn air. Eddie stood waiting at the front door, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. "Back again, Detective." Eddie's voice was smooth but lacked its usual charm. "I've got questions about Richard Harper," Beist said without preamble, stopping just short of Eddie's front steps. "And this time I expect some real answers." Eddie's expression didn't change, but Beist noticed a flicker in his eyes, just a momentary hesitation. "Richard Harper? He's been gone for years. What does he have to do with any of this?" "You tell me," Beist replied, stepping closer. "Harper didn't just disappear. He had business ties with you, and more than one person has told me he had ties with Elizabeth Thompson, too. That's a lot of coincidence for a man who vanished without a trace." Eddie's jaw tightened, his hands still buried in his pockets. "You've been listening to old gossip, Detective. Richard and I had our differences, sure, but people disappear all the time. He had problems, debts, enemies. Any one of those could have gotten to him." "Debts that you helped him cover up?" Beist pressed. "Or debts you made sure would never be repaid?" Eddie's eyes flashed with anger. "You're out of line, Detective." "I'm just getting started," Beist growled. "Martin Koskin saw someone murdered that night, and I'm betting it wasn't Elizabeth's Elisa. Someone is using Harper's death to twist your arm, aren't they? Maybe trying to get you to slip up?" For the first time, Eddie's calm facade cracked. His eyes hardened and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're playing a game you don't understand, Beist. If I were you, I'd be careful about what you dig up. You might not like what you find." "Is that a threat?" Beist asked, his heart pounding as he held Eddie's cold stare. "It's advice," Eddie replied, his voice chilling. "Take it or leave it." Beist wasn't fazed. He'd heard bigger threats from men with far less to lose. But this conversation only confirmed what he'd suspected. Eddie Frost wasn't as untouchable as he wanted to seem. He was scared, and fear made people reckless. The next morning, Beist was back at the station, his desk piled with reports from Linda's digging into Richard Harper's disappearance. She had uncovered old financial records, connections to shady real estate deals, and a trail of questionable transactions linking Harper directly to Eddie's businesses. It was clear Harper had been a thorn in Eddie's side, but there was still no proof that Harper was dead, at least, not yet. Linda burst into the office, a phone in her hand and a look of triumph on her face. "Detective, you're going to want to hear this. I just got off the phone with the coroner's office. They found a body 6 years ago, a few months after Harper's disappearance. It was badly decomposed, dumped in the woods about 50 miles out of town. No ID, no dental records on file, and no one came forward to claim him." Beist sat up straight. "You think it's Harper?" "It could be," Linda said, excitement building in her voice. "The coroner said they kept the remains in cold storage after they couldn't identify him. With today's technology, we could run DNA tests and match it to any relatives of Harper's." Beist's heart raced. "Get the paperwork started. I want those tests done as soon as possible." As Linda rushed off to make the arrangements, Beist felt a surge of adrenaline. If that body was Richard Harper, everything would change. Eddie would no longer be able to hide behind threats or money. He'd be exposed as the ruthless killer Beist suspected he was, but that meant Beist had to move fast, because if Eddie knew Beist was closing in, there was no telling what he might do next. Later that night, Beist sat alone in his office, staring at the photo of Richard Harper from the case file. The man had vanished without a trace, but Beist was so close to bringing him justice. But something still nagged at the back of his mind. Why stage a murder to make it look like Elizabeth had died? Who was manipulating Eddie, and why? As Beist pondered these questions, his phone rang, cutting through the silence. It was Linda. "Detective, you're not going to believe this. The DNA test came back. It's a match. The body is Richard Harper." Beist felt a chill run down his spine. The body had been found, but that meant the danger had only just begun. "Get a patrol on Eddie Frost's place," Beist ordered, his voice cold and steady. "He's going to know we're on to him." He hung up the phone, already grabbing his keys. Eddie Frost had been playing a dangerous game for years, but now it was about to come crashing down. All Beist had to do was make sure he got there before Eddie made his next move. Detective Emmett Beist's mind raced as he sped toward Eddie Frost's mansion. The discovery of Richard Harper's body had blown the case wide open, and he knew Eddie wouldn't go down without a fight. Beist's instincts told him Eddie would try to flee, or worse, cover his tracks by any means necessary. As he neared the estate, the familiar weight of dread settled over him. Eddie had always been one step ahead, but now, with Harper's body identified and the walls closing in, Beist knew Eddie's cool facade would start to crack. The sky was darkening as rain began to fall, casting a haunting atmosphere over the scene. When Beist arrived at the mansion, the gates were open just like before, but something felt off. There were no lights on inside the house. The patrol car he'd requested was parked just down the road, but the officers were nowhere to be seen. Beist's pulse quickened. He parked his car and cautiously approached the house, gun drawn. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushed against it. Inside, the house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made Beist's stomach churn. He stepped inside, the sound of his boots echoing through the grand hallway. "Eddie," Beist called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. There was no answer. He moved further into the house, scanning each room as he went. The living room was empty, the kitchen untouched. It wasn't until he reached Eddie's study that he found the first clue, a shattered glass on the floor, along with a hastily opened drawer. It looked like Eddie had been packing in a hurry. Suddenly, a noise upstairs, a door slamming shut. Beist's heart raced as he bolted toward the grand staircase. He moved quickly but cautiously, every step bringing him closer to the confrontation he'd been anticipating since the beginning. At the top of the stairs, he could hear muffled voices behind one of the doors. He approached it, pressing his ear to the wood, and heard two voices, Eddie's and someone else's. A woman's. Elizabeth Thompson. And Beist kicked the door open, his gun raised. Inside the dimly lit room, Eddie stood near the window, a gun in his hand, and Elizabeth, pale and trembling, sat in a chair across from him. Eddie turned, his face twisted in anger. "You just don't know when to quit, do you, Beist?" Eddie hissed, his voice dripping with venom. Beist kept his gun trained on Eddie. "It's over, Eddie. We found Harper's body. We know everything." Eddie sneered, waving the gun carelessly between Beist and Elizabeth. "You don't know a damn thing. Do you think this is just about Harper? He was a nobody, a loser who got in over his head. But this is about power control. You and that drunk Martin think you can take me down? Or nothing." Beist's voice remained calm, steady. "Put the gun down, Eddie. It's over. You can't talk your way out of this." But Eddie wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, darting between Beist and the window. The rain outside had turned into a downpour, and Beist could see that Eddie was weighing his options, fight or flight. "You're not walking out of this," Beist warned, taking a step forward. Eddie's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could make a move, Elizabeth sprang from her chair, grabbing for his arm. The sudden struggle caused Eddie to lose his balance, and in the chaos, a shot rang out. Beist fired once, aiming for Eddie's arm, and the gun flew from Eddie's hand as he stumbled backward. For a moment, the room was filled with the deafening sound of the gunshot and the crash of Eddie hitting the floor. Elizabeth screamed, stepping back in horror. Beist rushed forward, his gun still drawn, but Eddie was done. He lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck, groaning in pain. "It's over," Beist said again, breathing hard. "You're done, Eddie." Eddie Frost was taken into custody that night, his empire of lies and control finally crumbling. As the paramedics arrived to treat his wound, Beist watched from the porch, the rain soaking through his coat, but he didn't care. He was tired, but he felt the satisfaction of a long, twisted puzzle finally solved. The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations. Eddie Frost had orchestrated Richard Harper's murder 6 years ago, using his influence to cover it up and silence anyone who might know the truth, namely Elizabeth. Harper had threatened to expose Eddie's illicit dealings, and Eddie had made sure he disappeared for good. But someone, likely one of Eddie's own associates, had grown tired of his control and staged Elizabeth's fake murder to turn the heat on Eddie, using Martin Koskin as a pawn. Elizabeth Thompson, terrified for her life, finally came clean to Detective Beist. She had known about Harper's murder all along but had kept quiet out of fear and desperation. Eddie had used her, paying her off to maintain her silence while keeping her under his thumb. But with Eddie's arrest, she was finally free from his grasp.